Good morning, everyone. My name is Lorenzo Mariani, a research fellow at the International Affairs Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our virtual roundtable on EU-Japan security relations. The event is part of a series of annual meetings that IAI has been organizing since 2016, with the aim of bringing together Japanese and European experts and provide them with a platform for sharing ideas that have the potential to move forward the EU-Japan cooperation in multiple areas. In today's meeting, we will address two relevant topics that might have a significant impact for both Tokyo and Brussels in the near future. In the first panel, we will discuss about challenges to the future security environment in relation to the US-China systemic rivalry. And we will try to see how this competition between the two great powers will have an impact on the EU and Japan. And in the second panel, we will focus on possible strategic convergence between Japan and Europe in the Indo-Pacific region. So, having said that, first of all, I would like to thank all the participants to this roundtable, and I will serve as a moderator for the first panel, and I will be joined by Janka Vertel, Director of the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Meya Nowen, Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Professor Kenendo from Hokkaido University and the European University Institute, and Tsuneo Watanabe, Senior Fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So, before starting our conversation, just a quick reminder for the speakers. You will have up to 7 minutes for your initial presentation, your initial statement. At the end of all presentation, I will then open the floor for debate. I really want to encourage all participants, even those who will speak in the second panel, to participate actively in the debate. And having said that, I really don't want to bother you any longer with my initial presentation, and I think that we should start with the first panel. So we will proceed in the following order. We will hear first from Janka, then Meya, Ken, and Tsuneo. So if everything is okay for you, and Janka, if you are ready, I think that I'm gonna leave you the floor. Please.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to IAI. It's fantastic to be here this morning or this afternoon in Japan. So let me start right out by basically attacking the title. US-China systemic rivalry sort of suggests that the others don't have any agency in this. And this is a kind of binary rivalry going on where the others just have to relate to. And I would say for Europe, that is definitely not true. Europe too has defined China as a systemic rival back in March 2019 in the Strategic Outlook document. And if anything, since then, the strategic rivalry component of the relationship has become even more pronounced. I think this was brought about not necessarily by the US-China conflict, but by three factors: by China's actions at home, China's actions in the region, and China's approach towards Europe. China's actions at home, I don't think we need to kind of go into greater detail here, but the situation in Hong Kong, the situation in Xinjiang, shrinking space for international business, particularly European business as well, the dual circulation strategy, the environment in China is changing, and that changes the attitudes. Second point, China's actions in the region. the actions vis-a-vis Taiwan, the border spat with India, the coercive actions vis-a-vis Australia. This is definitely changing also how Europeans view China's role in the world. And then lastly, China's approach towards towards Europe. During the coronavirus pandemic, one could have argued that China had a massive opportunity at hand to shape the European views in its favor. And that was definitely squandered as an opportunity. Wolf warrior diplomacy, mask diplomacy, attempts to split the European public opinion over this, and definitely kind of an aggressive approach towards shaping the narrative in Europe. Recent ECFR polling data shows that the opposition to Chinese investments as a result of that, for example, is very widespread now all over Europe. It's much stronger in the wealthier countries than in the less wealthy economies, but it's also surprisingly true, for example, in the north, where investment used to be very high. So while that trend of growing skepticism is highly present, due to the US-China relationship, European leaders are simultaneously hedging their bets. And this is where it becomes a little schizophrenic in the European relationship. It is, instead of kind of making a real attempt now at the outset of the Biden administration and jointly shaping the agenda with partners and allies, especially with the US and Japan, and making use of the restart of transatlantic relations and multilateral cooperation, Europe at the moment is sort of sending mixed messages. It is, in some instances, even directly choosing not to prioritize building a common agenda in the name of what is currently called strategic autonomy. But you can go by the fashion of the words European sovereignty, strategic autonomy. It's sort of used interchangeably. This was particularly prominent around the decision late last year to kind of find a general agreement around the comprehensive agreement on investment with China. Which was pushed through quite hard by the German Council presidency, which has led to not only frictions within Europe, but also a lot of kind of irritation among partners, not only across the Atlantic, but also in Japan, in India, in Australia, where the seriousness of Europe's commitment to alliance conversations and an actual commitment to shaping the conversation around systemic rivalry have emerged. This was also prominent in the speech that Macron gave last week, talking about China in a very, very equidistant way, being very careful and very cautious in his remarks, kind of shaping and telling directly that there would be a third way. This idea of the third way for Europe, of being able to avoid any kind of alignment, is a strategic mistake. Because it allows Europe is not kind of clear in its understanding that it cannot do what it wants to do, and it cannot exert the leverage that it wants to exert, and it cannot change the policies that need to be changed for Europe to be prosperous in the future in the dynamics that are going on by itself. Europe does not want decoupling from China. Neither does the new US administration want to have a full head-on counter-China strategy. Europe wants to find areas for cooperation, so does the new US administration. The new US administration has moved away from an aggressive countering China strategy to a policy stance that is much closer to that of Europe and the allies in the Indo-Pacific region. But Europeans fail to make use of that potential at the moment. The Chinese leadership is at the moment very clear about its ambitions. And the big worry remains that the Europeans fail to translate the European sovereignty agenda that was born out of the panic of the Trump administration into concrete action with long-term strategic vision for the international legal, economic, and technology order. Europe cannot do what it wants to do alone. If it could, then that would be fine. But the power shifts that are going on are making that impossible. The US has already recognized that it itself cannot deal with the non-military China challenge by itself. And either Europe has decided that all hope is lost and is kind of going for whatever small gains it can reap in the meantime, or it lacks that strategic perspective. But by kind of clinging on to the China agenda in an old way, Europe is not only creating problems for itself, it is literally undercutting the sovereignty agenda, playing into new forms of dependency that then are created in the Chinese market. And I do think that that's something that has often been overlooked. It is time for Europe now to really engage on these issues and not give room to Chinese efforts at winning over select European governments for perceived yet short-term economic gains. And the place where I sit, right here in Berlin, is probably the most prone to that. Not making these choices at the moment and just sitting there idly is no sign of European strategic sovereignty. It would be a strategic and diplomatic victory for China. And let me leave it here.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I think that I do foresee that maybe we will discuss a lot on the idea of on the whole idea of strategic autonomy. I mean, I think that you really introduce a topical thing here. I think that we can move on. Maya, if you're ready, please.
Sure. Thank you, Chair, and thank you also for the invitation to speak at this very interesting and timely panel. So I wanted to argue that, yes, actually the US-China systemic rivalry has had an impact on middle powers caught between the two great powers. That's not to say that I don't agree with everything that Junke just said about the fact that there is an autonomous and very much organic relationship between the EU and Japan that is loose of, that stands separate from the relationship between the US and China, but of course it has an impact. The EU, European countries, and Japan have faced similar challenges during the US-China rivalry under the Trump administration. Both, of course, had to deal with a decline in the reliability of their main ally and security partner. Both have faced pressure to side with the US and China on certain issues and align themselves more strongly. And both have had to identify also their own political, military, and economic challenges that China posed to them. Analysts, I think, have talked about middle powers thus joining together to hedge against these challenges. But I'd argue that whilst the EU, European countries, and Japan can agree on the China challenge writ large, their approaches to addressing some of these challenges remain different, and in some cases, I would argue, are still a work in progress. And I'll touch on three different areas: security, technology, and defense. So in security, the real framework here is a strategic partnership agreement, which was signed between the EU and Japan, that has been partially implemented since 2019. And through this agreement, the two countries really pledged to promote their foundational shared values and principles of democracy, the rule of law, human rights, fundamental freedoms, etc. They also pledged to promote shared values and principles in international fora, thereby potentially filling the vacuum left by the Trump administration's America First policy and withdrawal from multilateralism. The SBA has sought to broaden the EU-Japan relationship as a result of these shared norms and principles, and it highlighted around 40 different areas of cooperation within security, from maritime security to cybersecurity, crisis and conflict management, arms control, climate change, you name it. And where possible, these challenges would not only be tackled bilaterally, but also coordinated through international and regional fora. This can be seen, for example, in cyber issues. But a key challenge, I think, then for the EU and Japan has been how to narrow down this huge bucket of potential areas of cooperation and shared interest into key priority areas. And we can see this through a number of steps. So the EU-Japan Joint Committee in its second meeting under the auspices of the SBA has identified cooperation on connectivity, security, and digitalization as key areas of priorities for the EU and Japan. Several steps have been taken, as I said. So firstly, the EU and Japan have begun cooperating on pushing back somewhat to China's Belt and Road Initiative through the EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure. The EU has identified Japan as a key partner, one of its key partner countries for its action plan on security cooperation in and with Asia, which focuses on maritime security, CT, crisis management, and cybersecurity again. And lastly, the EU and Japan are cooperating already on digitalization and technology policies. However, whilst some progress has been made, I think more can still be done. On technology cooperation, the fact that geopolitics has gone digital, of course, will surprise no one by this point. The US's campaign to restrict and in some cases roll back the use of Chinese telecoms equipment has been in full force since 2018. But the EU and Japan's responses here, however, have been a mix of convergence and hedging. I'd say, firstly, as a part of the SBA, both the EU and Japan emphasized the importance of shared norms and standards in technological cooperation. And as a result of this, the Economic Partnership Agreement and the Strategic Partnership Agreement between the EU and Japan has shown progress on the area of data protection. Through an agreement on data protection standards, Japan accepted and modeled part of its procedures on the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And Japanese companies now must comply with European standards, even when operating in third countries, with information that has originated from European providers, customers, or clients. And the EU and Japan also seem willing to cooperate on future technological innovation and investments. They've signed a letter of intent to strengthen cooperation in science, technology, and innovation to enhance the synergies between the EU's Horizon Europe and Japan's Moonshot programs. Similarly, the EU and Japan are also included in a discussion around forming a tech alliance of medium powers, such as the D10 initiative promoted by the UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson that would rival China's tech dominance. Now, back in 2015, the EU and Japan already signed a joint declaration of 5G cooperation. So we'd expect to see more convergence here on the Huawei debate. However, while Japan has banned Chinese companies from participating in its national 5G network rollout, not all EU countries have yet officially decided against using Huawei in their 5G national infrastructures. And Chinese technology companies are still heavily invested in European countries across the tech stack, from physical infrastructure to services and over-the-top platforms. And some European countries are still very much open for business with Huawei, such as France, who in 2015 announced, or Huawei rather in 2015 announced it would build its first mobile base station factory in France this year, though this will reportedly not have any influence on France's ultimate 5G decision. And whilst O-RAN is considered a potential solution to dependence on single suppliers in the telecoms networks, this too has received skepticism from some corners in Europe as to how it will impact Europe's own two telecoms tech giants, Ericsson and Nokia, as well as how realistic the rollout of this technology is as a quick fix to the security concerns some have over Chinese 5G networks. Lastly, on the issue of protecting national critical infrastructure and technologies, we also see a divergence in experience and policy. While Japan has been strengthening its foreign investment screening regime since 2019, the EU's investment screening landscape still very much remains an uneven one, despite an EU regulation that calls for the implementation of such regimes across all EU 27 member states by October last year. And as of today, 6 EU member states still have not made any moves towards implementing an investment screening mechanism. I thus argue that Europe still remains very much open for business to Chinese investments in strategic technological sectors in some ways. Lastly, on defense, whilst there are obvious areas of convergence of interest, Europe by and large has woken up to the China challenge, but the real military and security threat from China remains far more real to Japan at the moment than it does for most European countries. In most EU countries, challenges closer to home are still priorities, such as continued instability in the Middle East and North Africa, the threat of terrorism, and a resurgent Russia to the east. And of course, during the Trump administration, how to ensure that NATO survives. There also are limits to what is realistic in the near future for cooperation between Europe and Japan in defense terms. Only a few European Union member states can truly be active and proactive in deploying to the Indo-Pacific region, and with Brexit, that number has declined by 1. Aside from the UK's participation in freedom of navigation passages through the South and East China Seas, we see the UK continue to be plan to be present in the Indo-Pacific, plans to send HMS Queen Elizabeth into the region this year and conduct drills with Japan when it does so. Aside from that, within the EU, France, Germany, and the Netherlands have signaled greater ambitions to participate more actively in military terms in the region. All 3 countries, of course, having signed and having released and published an Indo-Pacific strategy of their own. Now, on those 3 countries, the US, Japan, and France will conduct, for example, an amphibious training mission on an uninhabited island in southwestern Japan in May. The Royal Dutch Navy have indicated that they'll join the HMS Queen Elizabeth in its first trip to the Indo-Pacific, and Germany will undertake one of its rare forays into defense diplomacy by sending a Navy ship into the Indo-Pacific in 2021. These are important signals both of support for regional countries in the Indo-Pacific as for the rules-based international system, but I'd argue that they're not all regular or permanent actions, which some countries in the region might so desire. And even when we view all of this, we need to keep in mind that European countries, of course, the ones that do have militaries that are capable of deploying further afield and being active in the Indo-Pacific region, can be spared only in light of peacetime at home. and regional security challenges closer to home will still maintain most of their attention. For Europe, the US's greater focus on the Indo-Pacific region and China in particular under the Trump administration raised concerns about how the US intends to balance its security commitments in Europe as well as in Asia. And lastly, whilst certain European states want to become increasingly involved in the Indo-Pacific, militarily speaking, they'll need to make difficult decisions as to how to prioritize defending national security at home versus working with partner country militaries on upholding the rules-based international system abroad. So a difficult and complex landscape that I think continues to evolve, and we've not seen the last of this discussion yet, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Couldn't agree more on the fact that, of course, I mean, we always say that there's a lot of room for cooperation, but in the end, I mean, a lot of fields of cooperation, but we really still lag behind, at least in my opinion. But I mean, thank you, because you introduced a very interesting topic, which is cooperation and technology, and I think that we should dig in this matter more during the discussion. Let's move on, and Ken, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Lorenzo, and many others who made this timely event possible. And then I have learned a great deal already from previous speakers, and thank you very much. And I just have 3 points to make. One on the renewed importance of EU-Japan cooperation. Now, these days, it's almost ritual to stress this importance of EU-Japan. And indeed, as previous speakers have pointed out, several factors point to the sort of golden age of EU-Japan. Now, I think the most important, the rise of an increasingly suppressive and intrusive China has finally caught the attention of European elites. And US leadership has become less dependable, despite the departure of Mr. Trump, despite the cross-party consensus to confront China. And the EU-Japan remains relatively resourceful still, and predominantly liberal democratic, and both of them growing painfully slowly out of a deeply entrenched culture of civilian power, perhaps. And public opinion on both sides are deeply skeptical toward the current regime of China. That's perhaps new in Europe over the past several years. And the EU-Japan have recently invested considerable amount of time and energy to upgrade their cooperation, both formally and practically, from the EPA, SPA to the joint naval exercises and so on. Now, as Maya stressed, at the same time, it is impossible to ignore the gaps between Europe and Japan. This is my second point. Both sides differ in perceiving the prime security threats. Europe preoccupied with Russia, Iran, Mediterranean challenges, with Japan predominantly concerned about China, perhaps apart from North Korea. And both of us perhaps do not have enough resources and perhaps the wills to execute the effective military operations on the other side's neighboring areas. And furthermore, the deep economic interdependence with Chinese market make ourselves rather compete than cooperate, as exemplified by the recent conclusion of RCEP and the EU-Japan investment agreement. Now, public opinions on China and perhaps on the US show a sort of patchy pattern across the countries. and may change over time in Europe. So it's fragile. And the vast scope of EU-Japan SPA remain largely void and teethless. So, despite the favorable international environment and window of opportunity, we still may not have enough, focus perhaps on to enhance our cooperation. Now, but still, in view of a rapidly changing picture of world politics, both sides are well advised to further update the status of our security cooperation. What is lacking is not the framework, as we have the all-encompassing sort of empty SPA, but a set of focused, concrete agendas, economic, military, and normative. One, I think it's better to create a sort of joint mechanism, some sort of joint venture with which to mitigate the damage on a specific country politically targeted by Chinese de facto economic sanctions. You name it, like, Australia, Sweden, or before Norway, Japan as well, just after the 2010s incident nearing the Senkaku Islands. We are one by one targeted by China. And we haven't done anything really to run counter to this, Chinese unilateralism. We should have some sort of common frames to run counter. Second, although it's rather symbolic, I think it's still meaningful to strengthen the security cooperation by, mainly by Japan, perhaps further incentivizing the Europe's semi-permanent presence of air and naval forces, and reinforcing the joint military exercise in the Indo-Pacific region. It will send signals to Beijing so that we would not allow the limitless unilateral actions on the part of China. Three, it's better to promote a sort of global norm coalition, preferably with the United States, so as to systematically watch and jointly deal with the human rights abuses, civil society subversion, disinformation exercises, and cyber operations. I think we better focus on a concrete set of agendas to enhance our security cooperation. Now, if I may have more.
Sorry.
Should I continue or should I stop here?
No, because I don't know if it was for me. But there was a little bit of a glitch at the very end of your presentation. So, okay, no, it's okay. You're perfectly in time, and yes, I was just, I was thinking because you mentioned the idea of the global coalition to monitor, human rights. And I think that this is another thing that we should discuss in our conversation later on. But I think is that basically, we build this order. We already built the institution that should watch and monitor human rights abuses. So, and during the last few years, some of us, in the international arena, undermine this institution. So I really look forward to discuss more on this. Let's move on. Please, Professor Tsunawa Watanabe.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for me to invite to talk. Especially, I'm watching a U.S.-China relation since I was in 10 years think tank work in Washington, D.C. in 95 to 2005. So it's a very interesting shift. Policy shift is occurring. The clearly engagement mind in the U.S. policymaker has lost. More competitive, that's clear. And probably that's not a tentative move. It's clearly the continuation from Trump administration to Biden administration, and even after this. I try to define, this is a kind of a policy paradigm shift from a cooperative engagement to competitive engagement, but still engagement, because that's clearly, even the Trump administration, the Pompeo, State Secretary Pompeo said he was very tough, but didn't say the containment. Nobody say containment, impossible, that's clear. So engagement is a more tough measure, probably more export control, and also limitation on Chinese investment. And that's the target, is clearly try to stop inflow of very the critical military and dual use technology from US to China. And trouble for, not trouble, but shared interest between US and Japan, or US and European countries. Clearly, we shared this kind of critical technology. So without cooperation or coordination, impossible to control such kind of inflow of technology or some products. So how we do, that's very important, because I think even the US companies shared a lot of interest in the Chinese companies' counterpart and Chinese interest. And that's very true with European countries, European business, and Japanese business. And the United States is now creating a very tough measure for the especially critical defense technology inflow to China. The ECRA, Export Control Reform Act, ECRA in 2018. That was a kind of a symbolic one, but actually very tough one too. That was passed with the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019. And that was kind of combined with another one. You may heard of FARMA, that's a Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act. That's also passed in 2018. And that's clearly bipartisan support. So even in the Trump administration's time, very much bipartisan support over the Congress enabled it. So that's continued in the Biden administration. And by the way, the Biden administration's engagement stance is pretty similar to the Pompeo said. I'd like to point out that you may realize Pompeo's speech in October last year at the Nixon Library. Clearly, Pompeo said U.S. engagement policy toward China failed. And now, Biden administration handling Chinese policies, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, and the Indo-Pacific coordinator Kurt Campbell. These people actually wrote a lot of essays, and one essay clearly in the Foreign Affairs in September, October 2019. They said the very similar tone, US expectation on China with engagement failed. But at the same time, they didn't say we need to shift to the containment. Rather, they tried to be more creative to how to cope with China while competing with China. Probably that's going to be the tone for the Biden. And even the Trump administration, I remember the Vice President Pence speech at the Hudson Institute for the famous anti-China competitive the address. Pence said, no decoupling, because it's impossible to decouple. So that's good news for anybody, because somehow still the interdependence of economy is a kind of the hedge or safety for the de-escalating conflict. But at the same time, of course, we live with the business profit, and that's good news for the European business, Japanese business, and even the US business. Bad news is things is more complicated. What technology we can tell, we can send, what technology we cannot. And the US basic policy is pretty much trouble, because that may apply to not only US company, but the European company, Japanese company, and big fines. Actually, I tell you how much fine. You know, civil case, in case of the trouble for the ECRA, civil case, $300,000 fine, or double amount of trade price. Criminal case, less than $1 million fine, or less than 20 years of imprisonment. And I'm sure US government is asking European governments and the Japanese government to share this same kind of legal things. Not yet. So what we should do, definitely we need to coordinate with the United States, but also we need to coordinate between Japan and the European countries. That's very important to prepare for things. That's actually the not so new things. Remember when 80s and the 90s, I don't know, you're watching a trade conflict between Japan and United States and at that time EC. I think sometimes Japan and EC had a very good collaboration to check US sometimes a very too much the troubled act to save principle for the free trade. Sometimes we work together very we cooperative manner. So total goal between Japan, European country, and US is on China. Is clearly we'd like to deter China's assertive action, human rights, democracy also. But at the same time, we'd like to have a very smooth engagement. But probably cooperative engagement is gone, but still competitive engagement is because we don't want any military conflict. We really need to influence China to be the more cooperative manner to the international market, international rule. Yes. So yeah, let's talk between why not Japan and the European country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, I cannot refrain myself from just raising some points here. And I mean, we all learned that maybe the idea of having a cooperative engagement with China was, especially from the European point of view, maybe a little bit too much naive. I'm wondering whether even the idea of having a competitive engagement is naive too. And I mean, I will try to explain. So, I mean, we can say as much as we want that we are not prone to any kind of containment towards China, but at the very end, it is China that I mean, China is also involved in this thing. I mean, if China perceives that this is a containment strategy, then I mean, we can repeat, I mean, till the end of the universe that we are not doing a containment policy, but maybe we are failing in our communicating so. So let's start with our debate. Anyone wants to raise a point or make some comments to the presentation so far. We also have,
Lorenzo, if I may, since I'm here, I'm just gonna drop some questions. I actually have three main questions. One is one is for Janka, whether she could elaborate a bit more on the new forms of dependencies that are being created. I think it would be great to know a bit more about that. One is for Maya, and is you did say that the investments, the European framework for investments is a step forward, but at the same time you still have 6 countries who haven't done any progresses or haven't moved forward. But of those who have, I think we saw even most recently some very interesting developments regarding excluding SOEs from public tenders, or talking about conflict of interests when it's 2 different Chinese companies, but they're both from China, and so they are seen as the same entity. And this is a very interesting development in the European Union. So I was wondering whether not just you, but the speakers think this is something that will become more structural perhaps in the future. And my final question is for Ken. And you spoke about a joint mechanism to mitigate the effect of China's de facto sanctions. And I would like to know whether you have an input on how that might look like. Like the idea of what type of measures would this joint mechanism adopt, for example, in the case of Australia or Sweden, Norway, or whatever. These are my questions, and I forgot to thank you all for your interventions. They were fantastic. Thank you so much. Sorry if I just jumped into the questions before thanking you.
Thank you, Francesca. Anyone wants to add another question, maybe related to things that has been said by Francesca? No, so please, who wants to start responding to this first round of questions? Maya, please.
Sorry, Janka. I might just answer. I have a very quick response to Francesca, who, for those who don't know her yet, is writing a fantastic PhD on investment screening mechanisms. So I am not preaching to a general audience here. But thank you, that's a really good question. And you're absolutely right to say that certain countries in the EU have taken stronger approaches to investment screening and aligning their mechanisms with that of, for example, CFIUS in the United States closer than others. My concern here, though, is that the unequal and uneven application of these measures across the European Union's 27 member states still allows for some integration and some investment in different areas within the EU, within the European Union by Chinese companies, and that could still be strategic. So different countries can still adopt a different view on what is particularly strategic in their national environment and system than others. The other issue that I have here is the fact that it's this EU regulation, which, albeit it was a positive step in the right direction, is still a non-binding mechanism, right? So what this calls upon is for EU member states to establish investment screening mechanisms or bring existing investment screening mechanisms up to the standard that the EU has proposed in its regulation, to establish some sort of baseline amongst the EU 27 member states. But on the other hand, the mechanism works in the sense that EU countries can be called upon by other EU member states or by the European Commission to investigate a certain investment that is proposed into their country and economy. The European Commission will consider that, national governments will consider that, but anything that is decided from that is still an advice and not a permanent or obligatory decision. So at the end of the day, the EU mechanism here, I think, is probably still not the one where competence lies, and thus that puts the European Union in a particular, I think, scenario compared to countries like Japan, which are just able to regulate and scrutinize to a much higher degree the investment that comes into their country. So yeah, I think, as I said, an imperfect first step, but that inequality, I think, is still concerning.
Yeah, maybe I take Francesca's other question, but maybe just as a comment, I couldn't agree more with Maya. I think the problems and the differences that we see and also in the interpretation of the FDI screening regulation is going to create a bit of chaos in some instances. And I think this is exactly where especially Chinese investors who have good legal knowledge will be able to identify all the little gaps that are there and will be able to utilize them. So I do agree with you that it's a good step also from the German side to look into kind of how do investments accumulate if they are coming from China, both of them coming from China. That does definitely make sense from like a defensive perspective, but also it will be hard to really go into the details of that. We will spend a lot of time and bureaucratic energy kind of filtering that, where at the same time, the other side is going to spend a lot of time in trying to find the holes. So I'm a bit worried that we're not dynamic enough in also kind of making this work over the long run. That's one of the concerns. And in terms of the new forms of dependency, my biggest concern with the comprehensive agreement on investment is not, as many people say, ILO standards. That's not what it was designed for. A comprehensive agreement on investment will not fix the human rights situation in Xinjiang. It will not fix the question of forced labor alone. It has to contribute to it, but it will not fix it alone, that's for sure. My biggest concern is actually that it actually incentivizes further investment in China. It incentivizes European companies, first and foremost German companies, to double down on their investments, to double down on their activities in China, to not diversify, to increase the risk accumulation in the Chinese market, and to increase their dependence on then Chinese forms of regulation that we already see kind of emerging, where all the little bits and pieces are sort of starting to emerge and starting to line up in terms of creating leverage and weaponizing the Chinese market against players that do not fulfill the political goals that the Chinese Communist Party wishes. So I am concerned that instead of making a bold push for investments in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, this kind of clinging on to the idea of China being the only growth motor in the region is actually in the longer run to the detriment of the European economy.
May I? Lorenzo? Right. Thanks very much, Francesca, for the opportunity to expand the point that I made on the joint mechanism. Now, I was thinking of the act of solidarity, perhaps within the framework of G7, plus, open for the coalition of willings, inclusive of Australia, for instance. They have been targeted, obviously, for political reasons. And I myself have been drinking Australian wine over 1 week when they were targeted. But this sort of individual level efforts are not obviously enough. So, perhaps I think the G7 plus should be able to substitute, let's say, even 5 to 10% of the damage inflicted by China. The import goods, services of a targeted country. We should create some sort of mechanism to mitigate the pains inflicted by the Chinese de facto sanctions. That's my broad direction. Now, if I may I ask to Watanabe-san on the relationship with China? I fully accept that the containment is not possible. But at the same time, we are challenged by China in many ways in the security field. So what sort of form should it take, when we face China, both Japan and Europe? Now, especially when we think of for instance, the RCEP and investment agreement that EU made with China, if I may. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking question. Actually, due to the limitation of time, I didn't talk about what kind of form U.S. is taking to China, not the engagement, not containment, and competitive engagement. Probably the form would be the so-called partial disengagement. That is a kind of a common word. Some people say the partial decoupling. Well, same things. What is that? What is that? Probably they don't figure so much yet, but clearly identify the serious strategic the inflow of technology or the product or person. And that's probably already the Trump administration started over. But Trump's ways are very one-sided. That's sometimes very effective to China, but not so effective with a U.S. allied partner. That's one of the agenda Biden administration that keeps saying we work together with allied partner. You know, but again, the coordination is so complicated, especially already the two panels from Europe pointed out that even within EU coordination for some investment regulation is not so easy. Same thing applied to the export control too. But we need to talk anyway. So we don't want too much loophole. But at the same time, there's no complete one. So one suggestion is probably Japan already started with Australia and India together for the rethinking of a supply chain. I think that kind of idea would be applied to the European too. So otherwise, a disaster for business. If a disaster for business, business do not follow the rule and very ineffective. That's my sense.
Thank you very much. And I know that we are running out of time, but we have a question from one of our friends and colleagues that are watching this this panel, and we have a question from Stefania Benaglia. Stefania asks the Japanese speakers if, in your opinion, do the EU still has a credibility gap to fill as a global security actor? Is very precise and effective. So, and since we have only a few minutes, Ken Tsunewo, if you want to share your opinion on this.
Well, if I may, the EU doesn't have any military forces in itself. It depends on the member states, forces. Japan, likewise, is still constrained by the Article 9 and the post-war consensus still, but consensus may not be there as before. But anyway, the constraints are there, and Europe is having has had sort of division of labor between EU and NATO, and with EU projecting the global political goals, it still lacks the sufficient means. So the basic thesis of the Professor Christopher Hill's credibility gap is still there, although the gap is being partially filled. That's my view.
My idea on the credibility gap is probably more the difference of threat perception. Clearly, China is more seriously to Japan, and U.S. is taking more seriously than Europe. U.S. is taking China more seriously than Europe. So, but that keep happening to any place, any time. So, how to reduce the gap is an issue for the partners.
Thank you very much. And I mean, there's a very interesting paper that has been published last year by Professor Emil Kirchner on different threat perception between Europe and Japan. It was really insightful. I mean, we have a question from Professor Iwama, please.
Yes. Do you hear me? I just wanted to ask about the meeting that was held 2 days ago between China and the Central and Eastern European countries, the 17+1 framework. What was the feeling on the European side, which direction this was going, and how you feel about this at all?
Who wants to?
Lorenzo, should I take that one? I will be quick. So the general assessment of the meeting was that it wasn't a great success for the Chinese side, that it was less prominently, not only there was not only less prominent representation, but it also was less prominently talked about. There's a lot of disillusionment with what China actually has to offer to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. There is a bit of a divide emerging between the countries in the Western Balkans and Southeastern Europe and then Northeastern Europe. And I think that's always been the problem with the 17+1 format. You know, you have the staunch transatlanticists, the Estonians and the Baltics in there, and you have the Southern European countries. So this has never been like a homogenous group that was kind of a convenient form that could be tested and tried. But I think it has sort of outlived itself as a format that is actually going to have a big impact. So I think it's more interesting to see what will be the transformation of this. Will we see kind of a splitting off? How long will this kind of shell exist for some sort of purpose? I wouldn't be too particularly concerned about it in terms of EU unity per se. I think that's something that, you know, where 17+1 isn't the biggest problem. I would be more concerned about the German position in that regard.
Thank you, Janka. And I mean, we are perfectly in time. So I really don't want to waste this opportunity to close, I mean, maybe for the first time in my life, a panel at the exact time. So, and I'm going to leave the floor to my friend and colleague, Francesca, who will chair the second panel. Please, Francesca.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you so much to the first panel, to the speakers from the first panel. It has been incredibly interesting. And now we move on to a second topic, which is as interesting as the first one. We're going to talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific and the European and Japanese approach to this. To talk about this topic today, we have 4 fantastic speakers. We have Yuichi Osoya, Professor of International Politics at Keio University, Nanae Baldoff, a researcher at Ghent Institute for International Studies, Giulio Pugliese, who is lecturer at the University of Oxford and part-time professor at the EUI. And finally, we have Yoko Iwama, professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. So welcome, everybody. I hope we'll have a great conversation and interesting exchanges. And if you're okay, and if Yuichi Osoya is ready, I'll leave the floor to you.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca. Can you hear my voice clearly? Great, thank you very much indeed. And I'm very delighted to be able to be a part of this great discussion at a very timely moment. At the same time, I really feel pity that I cannot visit Rome, a beautiful city, because we can use this kind of a webinar. But next time I will try to find some reason to visit Rome. But anyway, I will focus my talk on the 2 points relating to Japan's approach to the FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And I will focus on the 2 points. Firstly, I like to say that the basic nature of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision of the FOIP is to provide an inclusive vision of regional order. Japan has been consistent on its position to resist any exclusive regional orders since 1990s, when Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir, proposed a vision of EAEC, East Asian Economic Caucus, in which he tried to exclude the United States. Japan was against such vision. And at the same time, in the 1990s, Japan was the first major country who actually lifted economic sanction to China after the Tiananmen Square incident. And Japan was trying to find a way to introduce China to the WTO. So, well, I think that it is a consistent approach of Japan to try to create a kind of an inclusive vision of regional order. And on the other hand, China has a different vision for Asian regional order. Particularly, China was trying to and is trying to exclude both the United States and the European Union from a regional security order. For example, in May 2014, at the summit meeting of the SHICA is Conference for Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. China tried to exclude both the United States and Europe from Asia by launching a new Asian security vision. At that moment, President Xi of China said that China needed to create new Asian security vision by excluding both the European Union and the United States, because he said that, quote, Asian security must be maintained by the Asians themselves. So it's natural for China to try to be in a dominant position in its security by excluding United States forces and the British forces and the French forces and other European forces, because without these forces, of course, China can be in a very dominant position, because Chinese military budget is currently 5 times bigger than Japanese defense budgets. So it's really easy for China to dominate both East China Sea and South China Sea if there are no European and American forces. And secondly, I also would like to focus on the importance of Japanese strong desire to try to invite European country to this region. Because as I said, firstly, Japanese vision is basically quite inclusive. And not just that, because Japanese vision for regional order is based on the idea of liberal international order, to create and consolidate liberal international order in the Indo-Pacific region. It is essential to invite other liberal democracies, such as, of course, European countries, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, of course. So to create such kind of regional order, Japan really focused on the importance of basic norms such as freedom, openness, inclusiveness, human rights, and democracy. Particularly, the freedom of navigation is currently in danger because China is trying to exclude confrontational countries from both East China Sea and the South China Sea. So it is exactly opposite the customary international order or international law. So that's why I think that it would be much better for Japan to invite European country to join in the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And basically, Japan's is a kind of a declaration policy, such as the Atlantic Charter of 1941, which the United States and the UK actually created. It's a declaration policy to try to consolidate some of the important norms. Well, that's why I think that it would be really essential for European countries to try to join in the region, resisting to China's much more exclusive vision for regional security order, to try to consolidate liberal international order as well as the rule-based international order. I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and extremely effective time management. So I will move on to the next speaker. Nanae, if you would like to take the floor. Can you hear us?
Did you say it to me?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, great, yes, sorry about that. Thank you so much to the colleagues at IAI and to Lorenzo and Francesca for the invitation to participate, and it is my honor to be part of this panel. I was asked to talk about the strategic convergences or divergences between Europe and Japan on the Indo-Pacific. And of course, we have France, Germany, and the Netherlands have published their own strategy or guidelines. There are also voices that the EU and the UK should also put up their strategy or policy guidelines. But it is definitely too early to really discern any converging points or separating points at this time, of course, not least because of the pandemic. It is difficult to have face-to-face diplomacy or any traditional human contact as we know it before. So I'd like to highlight three concepts that are important trends in the Indo-Pacific, and that will help Europe to be more relevant in the region. And then I will also end my talk with the role of the EU. Just to put the whole Indo-Pacific in context in terms of relation between Europe and Japan. Initially, Japan did not promote its FOIP vision with Europe. That's perhaps because Japan did not expect Europe to play a clearly visible role in Asia, other than normative upholding and defending shared values. We should recall that the EU and Japan joint summit in 2018, the very day that the EPA and SPA were signed. There was no mention of FOIP, even though by then it was very clearly launched by Japan. And then, of course, President Trump in Vietnam spoke about FOIP. Australia, in the meantime, also put their foreign policy paper. And 1 year later, after the signature of the EPA and SPA, Prime Minister Abe traveled to Brussels at the EU and Asia connectivity launch event. And he did speak about Indo-Pacific once, but it was in the context of the connectivity linking Europe and Japan. So it was not promoting its own strategy, really. And also, in the meantime, the perception in Europe has changed, right? At the beginning, it was really associated with the negative perception of President Trump's administration, that the FOIP was really too confrontational to China. But the wind has definitely shifted, and that's all good news for Japan. Foreign Minister Motegi, less than a month ago, was invited to speak at the EU Foreign Affairs Council to really share Japan's approach. So there really is a great interest on the side of Europe to learn about Japan's approach. So I go to the three concepts. First is free and open, this normative, this adjectives that is just, Japan really places emphasis on these free and open. Free means free from coercion, that is not repressive. And that's exactly what Professor Hosoya just said. And open is inclusive and transparent. So this might sound a bit anti-Chinese to some states, but it is not Japan that isn't bullying other states or that's losing international legitimacy. So it's very clear. So that's the crux of Japanese approach. And the second concept is that there is bilateral relations are still dominant and very important, and that is complementary to multilateral cooperation. I will take the Quad as an example. The Quad is a multilateral group of Australia, Japan, India, and US, but it's because of strong bilateral relations, not just between Japan and each of the three, but among the three. And so that's the basis, and that's why trilateral cooperation was also strong, and the enduring element, bilateral element, really was at the base of the formation of Quad, and was able to even revive because of that. So, when it comes to multilateral cooperation, if we define that it's a cooperation of more than 3 states, then it's really not, multilateralism is not a prerequisite. I think the Europe, there's a sort of not a tendency to always sort of stick to multilateralism, or the alliance of multilateralism that was launched by France and Germany. But I think that should be more defined in order to bring other partners rally behind this. So just to take, for example, one example of sort of China's AIIB, this was praised as a multilateral cooperation, but it was a unilateral idea disguised as a multilateral cooperation. So we should take that, whenever we have China on board, we should take that as a grain of salt. And then the last concept is partnership. So there is a clear preference to go with this less binding and flexible form of alignment rather than alliance, the formal alliance. So of course, it can be a weakness, but at the same time, it's a comparative advantage, I think, for the region that this flexibility brings. So, membership in an alliance was always sort of an ultimate goal for NATO in Europe, but that is not the case. But NATO knows this. In the policy paper that the NATO published last November, it says partnership cannot be a substitute to membership, but we need to use these partnerships more strategically and purposefully than it has in the past. So Japan is the oldest oldest partner of NATO. I think the much more concrete cooperation can be expected, even incrementally, in terms of the FOIP. So to conclude, to the role of EU, EU's relevance to the region is its economic weight as the world's largest trading bloc. So could the EU join TPP, for example? Something to think about. And whether the EU should have its own strategy paper for the Indo-Pacific, I would say it's better to upgrade the current global strategy, and because it already has one essential element, the Asia-Europe connectivity is there, the rules-based order promotion is there. It's that way, if EU sends another strategic paper, for example, on the Indo-Pacific, it will just be a sort of a negative message that EU is just following events. It's just reactive. So that would be my proposal. I am there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for some very interesting remarks, and perhaps some of the most thought-provoking came at the very end. So I expect we'll receive quite a few questions about this, and we will continue the conversation. Now I leave the floor to Giulio, if you are ready.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesca, and thanks for having me. I'll bring back the conversation to the US factor within the broader context of the Indo-Pacific strategies, guidelines, outlooks that are flowering really around the world. Because the EU, as mentioned earlier, stars are aligning in the EU in favor of an Indo-Pacific strategic outlook that is not just going to be a key concept for important members of the EU, but for the EU itself. And on the face of it, actually, when the Dutch government published its own Indo-Pacific guidelines, the government explicitly referenced the American ones as a sort of inspiration, as if they were going to follow in their footsteps. But this is a misguided, of course, actually, genealogy of the Indo-Pacific, because the concept is eminently Japanese, really. Japan has exercised quiet leadership. And I think that what is interesting here is that there are different definitions depending on the country adopting the Indo-Pacific. But this is not just a matter of the stars aligning in being much more cynical and critical of Chinese behavior, especially in 2020. What we're looking here is that Japan's attitude towards the Indo-Pacific has changed. Professor Hosoya is the person to grill on this change, which is particularly important and I think strategically influential, because Japan had presented the Indo-Pacific as a strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific as a strategy, with military, strong geopolitical and military, and potentially also exclusionary components at the beginning. But it did change into a more inclusive vision. And so what I understand as the EU's and European member states' embrace of the Indo-Pacific concept, mind you, not the free and open Indo-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific concept, was very much in line with what was happening elsewhere. In 2019, ASEAN adopted its Indo-Pacific outlook. And so there was a willingness to really engage with other middle powers, such as Japan, ASEAN countries, potentially Australia. Australia has been also a very strong lobbying power behind doors for this concept. The UK and whatnot, to really come together and as global civilian powers, as middle powers that altogether have substantial economic leverage, they would also be able to preserve the multilateral liberal order that Professor Hosoya was referring to, also to maintain and regulate international behavior in economics and security. And I think that this is important to understand because if on surface you see the Dutch government echoing or expliciting the willingness to echo the United States government, actually what I see here is that there is a potential for these middle powers to come together and to, yes, sound very much like in line with US priorities, but in fact, there is the potential for these countries to better coordinate, not just to face China's assertiveness, if not aggressiveness, but also to avoid excessive behavior from the United States. Because, and this is something that is essentially my argument, my line of reasoning, is that in the back of policymakers' mind, for instance, in Germany, it's clear that there is a need not just to better confront and face the challenge posed by a rising and assertive China, but also to manage, at best, the potential disruptive implications that come with US relative decline. US relative decline that may harbing a more isolationist US foreign policy, if not an altogether destructive American foreign policy. Of course, this is an ally. So this thinking is not easily explicitated by foreign policymakers, in my cynical Italian opinion. But I think that this is in the backdrop of many. And so I'll give you some concrete examples. 2020 has been the year of, Europe's awakening to China's assertiveness, as mentioned by Dr. Ortel earlier on. But I would say that 2020 has also been the year of awakening to the real potential problems that come with the self-fulfilling prophecies and a US-China policy that is too much zero-sum. I'll give you some examples, and security, prosperity, and values are all affected. With regards, for instance, to America's whole of government response and pushback to China, we have seen influential American political scientists and China specialists describing it not just as containment, but sometimes as de facto regime change. And people like Matt Pottinger, the Deputy National Security Advisor, or even O'Brien or Pompeo have hinted at that. I wouldn't say it's that America's pushback has been really aimed at regime change, but certainly there was an aim at political warfare of some sort. And the European Union, with Germany at the forefront of that, has been particularly wary of avoiding needless provocations, such as labeling the coronavirus as the Wuhan virus within the G7 Foreign Ministry Summit. Germany and pretty much major EU member states have been pretty wary also of having a G7 plus summit with Trump and other leaders that ganged up on China, essentially, that was essentially an anti-China G7 summit. And EU member states, and especially the EU, have been also asking lots of questions about connectivity initiatives, such as the Blue Dot Network, where leading EU member states, G7 member states, sorry, are observants, and the EU as well, with regards to what does it mean? Is it really an inclusive initiative, this US-led Blue Dot Network that is aimed at raising the standards in government financing, openness, transparency, sustainability, and so on and so forth? Is it not a anti-China initiative? And so these questions have been asked, and with good reason. And I see then Europe's Indo-Pacific guidelines and incoming strategy, if you want, as navigating between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla of a rising and assertive China, but also the Charybdis of a potentially disruptive American pushback against China that hardens China's behavior. For instance, in Hong Kong and the wolf warrior diplomacy, I actually see security dilemmas at play. I don't just see Chinese assertiveness and aggressiveness, but I also see an excessive counter-reaction from China. And so this is a potential self-fulfilling prophecy, but that needs the help of US allies to also come together and potentially to constructively change also American behavior. I think I'm running out of time, but I'll conclude very briefly. The EU has, of course, a problem with political capacity at the moment. We are grappling with COVID-19, vaccination campaigns, the economic and political fallout coming out all of this. And I think that what will happen with the new Biden administration is that, yes, coordination is possible in many fields, but on the security one, we should make it clear that I think that hard choices will fall on the US in terms of budget cuts at the Pentagon, and these will likely affect European security. And so if European security is going to be affected because of less US forward deployment, then our attentions, together with the fallout of the pandemic and whatnot, will needlessly be more introverted security-wise. And projections in the Indo-Pacific, while welcome and at the invitation of like-minded partners, are perfectly fine and good, but they will be of a normative and signaling kind. I don't see a sustained crescendo in that field. What I see is realistic conversions on distorted market practice, distorted economic practices that China does, especially subsidies, for instance, of the WTO, economic security, and we've talked about export controls and investment screening, but also connectivity. And so this is a geopolitical commission, yes, but the great power competition, like zero-sum great power competition, is not in the EU and in Japan's interests, I might add as well. And so there is room for a more realistic convergence in our fields. And sorry for going ahead of time.
No worries at all. It was very interesting intervention, so it's worth going a little bit over time. Since we are doing great, I think I will just cede the floor to Yoko Iwama, for your intervention, if you are ready.
Okay. I was actually asked by Lorenzo to talk about Southeast Asia's place in this free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, I'm not a Southeast Asian specialist, I am more a European specialist, but my institute, GRIPS, has actually many Southeast Asian, Central Asian, and South Asian students. So our institute is 70% foreign students, and I think the majority of them from Asia. We also have students from Africa and Europe and some from American continent. But by far the largest group is from Asia. And I teach them international relations and I get feedback from them. One of the biggest challenge for me in teaching them the subject of IR has been that it has been so Euro-America centric. the subject, the history, the approach. You hardly talk about Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand. I really don't think I mentioned Thailand at all in my IR course. It's very difficult to bring them out, and they're quite unhappy about it. They feel they ought to be mentioned more, and they want to know more about the past of their countries. And I think, you know, I'm still thinking about it. I try every year to increase the proportion of the so-called South or the third world in my lecture, but it's been a huge challenge. Because one reason is that the Cold War has been presented as such a duopoly, such a zero-sum competition between the good and the bad, as seen from the American point of view, at least. Maybe not Europe, but still it was kind of a battle between free and open society and the communist dictatorship on the other hand. And more or less, I think we still have this structure, a framework in our head when we talk about US-China relationship. We try not to sort of go back into the Cold War, but our paradigm of looking at the world is still very much defined by what we learned during our youth and our formation years, because so much was dominated by, are you with the communists or are you against the communists? I mean, I was that generation, but I think we need a different approach precisely because, just as Julio said, that US is declining in the longer future. And the proportion of Asia is going to be the biggest in world history. And we need to somehow come to terms with it. Now, when I teach my students, by and all, they do react to our liberal, internationalist, institutionalist approach. But then when it comes down to reality, it doesn't really fit their world. For one thing, their world is not that of the modern state yet. They still kind of live half in the past and half in the present. I mean, that's partly true for a country like Japan, but we have, during the past 150 years, adapted to the Euro-America-centric worldview, whereas other Asians have 50 or 100 years to catch up. And I'm not sure if they want to catch up. Maybe they want a different paradigm, maybe they want a different narrative. Anyway, I'm spending too much time, but the feeling I often get when I hear about this FOIP approach is, of course, when my students in Japan, they're friendly to Japan, but I'm sure they're friendly to China when they go to China. So I don't think it's wise for us to make them to choose sides. They don't want that. I feel that very strongly in some countries more than the other countries. I mean, country like Philippines is most Japanese friendly, whereas other countries has a little bit more distance to us. But in any way, I asked a question about 17+1. And I think the small countries in between big giants, they are always pushed around, and they have suffered a lot from that history. I mean, Central and Eastern European countries and ethnicities, they were always pushed between Russians and Germans and Turks. And then Southeast Asians, they were always pushed between China, India, and then recently US and Japan. I mean, different combination in different times, but the fact is that they get pushed around and they get the paradigm of the bigger ones forced on them, even when they don't want it. So it's not going to be fruitful to play zero-sum game in this area. And I think that's precisely the reason Professor Hosea mentioned that this FOIP was an inclusive regional order, and it needs to remain inclusive. I saw an interesting survey yesterday, which was from the ISEAS, Yusuf Ishak Institute, the State of Southeast Asia 2021 survey report. And in that, they had this survey about which country do you trust most, China, EU, India, Japan, US. And guess what? Japan is the most trusted between these five, 67.1%. Next is EU, 51.0%. US, 48.3%, not bad. China, 16.5%. So, but this was, I think, a survey mainly amongst intellectual people, not sort of common, normal people. But that tells something that when EU and Japan has been historically more or less non-divisive, non-zero-sum approach countries in this region. And I think we need to stick to that. And also, I mean, we have been focusing on strategy, military strategy, a lot recently, and we saw Indo-Pacific strategy coming out of countries like Germany and Netherlands recently. But I still believe that combination of military plus non-military approaches, civilian approaches, are the strength of power like EU and Japan. And I think that is also welcomed in local communities, that we help in increasing human security, we increase their capacity in legal profession, we increase their capacity in police and order, rather than sort of really forcing them to tell black or white, because in the end, it's not possible for them to choose. And for many, I mean, China, India are for many Southeast Asian countries, internal as well as external countries. Their communities are mixed in ethnicity and traditionally have difficult relationship with Chinese and Indian minorities, not to speak of other kinds of minorities. And they're also very complex in religious map. And therefore, I really don't think that non-zero-sum divisive approach is a productive one. So I've used up my time and I'll stop here and wait for the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So many thought-provoking comments and analysis. Thank you so much to all of you. As always, I'll take the advantage of being the chair to shoot a few questions, if I may, and then we have a few questions from the public. To Yuichi, if I may ask, you commented about Japan inviting European countries to join the FOIP, but then my question would be actually in relation to something Nanae said, that the EU largest relevance is economic. So I tried to put these two questions together, and my question would be, the EU has limited military capability when it comes to projection in such a faraway region. And I think that Meya mentioned something like this about this before. And so my question is, how can you invite the EU to participate to FOIP without, first of all, risking not having an effective participation, and secondly, division within the European Union, because we know that actually very few countries do have this capability. And in relation to Nanae's question, is, the difficulty also of inviting the EU to participate into multilateral economic frameworks is that which standards would be applied. We saw that we had issues with, for example, the United States, we had issues with the trade agreement with Canada, and that is why probably in the past the EU has approached this type of agreements bilaterally rather than multilaterally. And then I'll move on to a question for Julia, which is avoiding an excessive behavior something to, is avoiding taking sides something and having a sort of more multilateral approach to the region, something to avoid and prevent excessive behavior from the US? Or is it something that we inherited from this experience with the Trump administration? So something to build a plan B, a solid plan B in case we don't have the US any longer. And finally, my last question to Yoko would be, I agree that the EU needs flexibility and both the EU and Japan, and we should not choose a side. But at the same time, shouldn't we have some red lines in terms of certain issues needs to be defended independently of who is breaching them or who is acting against them? And these are my initial questions. I'll ask you perhaps to answer these, and then we can move on to the questions from the public, and if you have questions as well. Who wants to go first? Should I?
May I answer to your question first? Well, thank you very much for your brilliant question about Japanese FOIP and the European role or EU's role in it. First of all, according to the Sun Tzu Chinese classics teaching, winning in the battle is the second best option. The best option is winning without the battle. So China doesn't like to open a large-scale war in the region. In the South China Sea, China actually could take nearly all the islands, remote islands, without opening a large-scale war. So I think that China is trying to do the same even in the East China Sea, like Senkaku Islands, and some of the islands belong to Taiwan. And it is quite probable that within a year or two, China will try to actually change the status quo by grasping these islands. So it would be really dangerous to foresee such kind of an event, because the United States might be willing to engage some battle or war against such kind of Chinese invasion. So one of the most important things in the region is try to prevent this happen. So like freedom of navigation operations by some of the French or British fleets in the region would be quite effective, because well, Chinese war is basically quite psychological. Try to attract as many countries as possible. So if European countries try to resist these kind of Chinese claims and try to prevent China to change the status quo in the region, I think this would be really effective. So we don't expect that Japan or EU will join in a large-scale war in the region, because according to the report made by RAND, American think tank, military think tank, Japanese self-defense forces will be defeated by Chinese military within several days without American participation. So we don't like to see that happen. So try to consolidate the rule-based international order is the first priority. And I think European Union can do so many things, much more in a sense than the United States, to try to consolidate such rule-based international order. So this is my basic understanding.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Please, Nanai.
Francesca, thank you. Thank you for the question. I would like to just mention that EU's role as a coordinator in the sphere of security dimension of the FOIP. I think that it has to be very clear, and I don't think that the partners in the FOIP region expect EU to be a military actor in this, and that's very clear. Any military aspect of the FOIP, then we think of NATO, we think of individual European nations, and I think that's just very clear. But when it comes to economic aspect of the FOIP, and I think Japan's FOIP is dominantly, it's economic, and it's, you know, it's the three pillars, right? The normative pillar and the economic pillar, and then the security pillar. Security pillar is less, I think, because of Japan's constraints as a military actor. And so it really, I think it helps everybody, all the partners in any projects, whether it's export control, investment screening, just to really be clear of what we're talking. If we're talking about military dimension of this of the FOIP, then it's bilateral, individual nations, NATO perhaps, EU in that. And then it's civilian management, crisis management. So it's just very specific. But when it comes to more economic, trade, investment, development, aid policies, then it's EU can, I think, should really be a coordinator. And I think the coordinator role, why not? It really shows the flexibility of EU. I mean, EU doesn't have to be sort of the dominant player everywhere all the time. So that's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you, brilliant. Sure, Giulio.
Thanks for the the question. I use the question to dispel some misperceptions that I may cause with my, some might say, provocative remarks. I'm not extolling the merits of not taking sides. The US is, of course, an important treaty ally through NATO, and we share so much in terms of prosperity, security values. But certainly, I would suggest the merits of the EU and like-minded partners and stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan, Australia, and others, South Korea, and ASEAN countries, to not take sides with provocative and unhelpful US positions, but may actually harden China's behavior. But in fact may have the opposite effect of deepening US-China strategic competition and ushering self-fulfilling prophecies, which is very dangerous. I can think of Taiwan, for instance. Certainly, China is to blame for many things, but we should be also wary of needless confrontations on the American side. And so the trick is really to get this right is for us to do what Professor Hosoya and Dr. Baldauf mentioned, that is that the EU should play a coordinating role to consolidate the rules-based international order. And by doing so, it would save the architecture that the US had actually built in the post-war years and post-Cold War years, based on multilateralism, openness, the so-called international liberal order, because we have stakes in it. And by doing so, we would be able still to reassure China of the merits of seeing our own deterrents and red lines as aimed still at engaging China. Otherwise, it's obvious that the Chinese government would think that we want to gang up to contain China. And so that reassurance is key, not just to get China right, but also to get our relationship with countries such as ASEAN countries that Dr. Iwama was mentioning, but do not want to pick sides. And so it's in our interest to show them that we are not taking, we're not, what's the word, tilting on one side always, right? Because there must be also a limit to confrontation, including that may happen from our own friends and great allies. And so the trick would be to use this coordinating role and emphasis on multilateralism and the international rules-based order, also to change American behavior, if needlessly provocative.
Thank you very much for your answer. Yoko, would you like to say something about? Thank you.
Thank you. Not much to add actually, but red lines. You know, something I would dream for in Asia would be something like 1975 Helsinki Declaration in Europe, that no forceful change of borders, respect of current state sovereignty, non-use of violent measures, peaceful change, respect for human rights, such kind of principles. If the regional forces could agree on that, that would be great. And then Helsinki Declaration was not, it was nothing that you could force upon anyone. And I think that's the most we can hope for in the region. But if we can hope for something like that, that would be great. Of course, Japan has its own red lines, and that is what Professor Hosea talked about, that we won't accept forceful change of borders by China. But can we enforce that everywhere in Indo-Pacific? Maybe America could if they wanted to, but not us, definitely not Europe. So I think Quad is something different from Indo-Pacific. Quad is a coalition of like-minded countries, and we are all sort of capable and functioning democracies. Whereas other countries, although we talk about rule-based international order, I mean, in order to uphold such order, I think you need to have a rule-based domestic order. And many countries haven't even come up with a coherent rule-based domestic order in this region. And we need to help them to do that and to convince them that in the longer run, it gives them a better future. And so I really don't think this is a military approach, but there are several principles that we should agree on, and we should not really let go of. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for answering my questions. Now I would like to ask you some of the questions from the public. One is from one of the previous speakers, Professor Ken Endo, to Yuichi Osoya. His question is about RCEP and whether RCEP might be damaging the Japanese national interest. To what extent it might be damaging the Japanese national interest. And another question is from, from the public, from Hiroaki Nakanishi. And his question is about whether, the European Union, NATO, Japan, Quad could form a sort of extended alliance, not to necessarily be confrontational, but to foster a positive agenda in terms of, climate, international peace and security, rule of law, etc. And One question is also from, is from before, is from Vito Fatuzzo, and his question is about the presence and the role of Japan in the Five Eyes, and whether this might actually mean that the US might incentivize Japan to what does it say? Okay, to rearm, to make it a balancer in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think there's also something to say about, perhaps giving agency back to these countries rather than always hinting to the idea that the US asks this country to do something. And I think we can start with these questions.
So may I answer to Endo-san's question first? I think that it's a very important question because it is important to clarify whether RCEP is damaging to Japanese national interests or not. Basically, my short answer to the question is that RCEP is not at all damaging to Japanese national interest, and I'm supporting Japanese participation in the RCEP because that benefits Japanese economic relationship with Asian countries. And also, besides, RCEP is based on the ASEAN centrality, not the Chinese hierarchy or hegemony. But on the other hand, I have a different sense in this because there is a widening gap between economic reality and American strategic necessity, because the United States is trying to promote a kind of a decoupling between US economy and the Chinese economy. But on the other hand, Japanese economy is much more being integrated within inter-Asian trade. Particularly at the time of the COVID-19, it is probable that Japanese economy would be much more deeply integrated to neighboring Asian countries, because it is now very difficult for Japan to open business interactions with America and also with European countries, considering the current spread of the coronavirus. So that's because the degree of the spread of the coronavirus is much more limited in Asian countries. That's why Japanese government decides to reopen a business transaction with neighboring Asian countries. So we will soon see much more integrated and a much more strong supply chain in East Asia with these. But on the other hand, the United States doesn't like to see it. And Japan's only ally is the United States. So I think that the current Japanese government is facing a very difficult situation to see such kind of the widening gap. And I have no clear answer, but well, because Japan is not an authoritarian regime, so Japanese government cannot fully control Japanese business companies. So that's why Japanese business company is trying to widen or broaden, deepen its business relationship with neighboring Asian countries. I think this is a basic economic reality.
Thank you. I would like to take on the next questions.
Yes. The enlarged NATO? Yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. This is a big question now. I have to start with the fact that EU and NATO are quite different as organizations. So you can't sort of bundle the two into one. Now, enlarged NATO, including Asia, I don't really see that. Of course, I think there should be more partnership between Japan and NATO, a more dialogue to talk about our perceptions. I think that will be useful, but geostrategically, we don't quite share same interest. I cannot imagine, for example, what we will support when the Baltic countries are attacked, but on the other hand, it's a long way to go. So I'm not sure what kind of military assistance we can give, and I think that's the same for European countries. The other thing is that I'm afraid an enlarged NATO in Asia would be too kind of developed world-centric, too much weight of Americans and Europeans in it. I think one of the strengths that China has in this region is that it's Asian. It's Asian, and it feels itself harmed and trampled upon by Europeans ever since 1840 something, whatever the starting point. Maybe much earlier in some Asian countries, but they feel they have been treated not so well by European powers, and that they want to be in the driving seat. And I think that we should let them, and we should just sort of remain in assisting roles. So enlarged NATO for me sounds too much of one thing America-centric and too many Europeans in it.
Yes, please, Julia.
Can we go a bit overboard because it's already 11? Yeah, can we? Okay, good.
A few minutes is allowed.
Good. Okay, I'll address the question by Vito Fatuzzo on Japan's participation in the Five Eyes and Biden's push for Tokyo's rearmament or not. Japan has a strong tradition of China watching, also because of historical cultural links with China. And I'm sure that on the human intelligence side, it has lots to offer. I think it has lots to offer also on North Korea, on signal. And so there is an added benefit of having Japan in the Five Eyes Club. And I would understand, the US and Australia's acceptance. I would also understand the United Kingdom's acceptance because of a largely unspoken about trade-off that the UK wants to build up a global Britain and needs Japan's support for involvement in the TPP, and I would imagine that the chips that the UK can offer it's still to the Indo-Pacific and possibly, accepting also Japan's entry into the Five Eyes Club. That being said, as you know, Five Eyes is an intelligence alliance built on shared culture, shared values, pretty much, the same language. And Japan lacks that. It's other, so to speak. And it lacks the security culture of states such as the US, Australia, and whatnot. And so the institutional basis and the security culture in Japan are still a deterrent in that regard, in my opinion. Very briefly on the other question that Vito poses, the Trump administration has actually since you would say of the Obama administration, the US has tried to foster and build up the security position of US allies, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and whatnot, so that they enforce their own anti-access area denial and build up their own asymmetric capabilities to deter China by denial. What is interesting is that with the Trump administration, you've seen a crescendo, also because Trump wanted to sell American weapons and make money and, balance the trade. And so you've seen also Trump acceding to something that, is interesting. Obama wouldn't want Japan to acquire offensive capabilities. Trump was in favor. And we're seeing this as a constant. So I think that there is a momentum for Japan to develop its own short and intermediate range missiles without nuclear warheads, don't get me wrong, after the scrapping of the INF Treaty. And the US would look favorably upon it. That's, offensive capabilities. And so, yeah, I see a crescendo, and I see that the Biden administration wouldn't necessarily change that much of the posture.
Lorenzo?
Thank you, Francesca. Yes, unfortunately, we ran out of time, and it's really a shame. I mean, we tried, as I said in my initial statement, this is an initiative that we organize every year since 2016. But of course, I mean, we have this roundtable in person, which is totally different thing. My gratitude goes to all the participants, all the speakers, and also to those of you who attended this meeting. And I really hope to reorganize a conference with these great panelists at this time in person in Rome, and we will not have to squeeze this great conversation in just a couple of hours, and we will bore ourselves to death for a day-long meeting. So having said that, thank you very much, and I think that we can stop now the registration, and thank you all. May I ask the speakers to stay a little bit longer? Thank you.